Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. It's a little intimidating, though, because I know there are quite a few people in this room who know a lot more about design than I do. Certainly Jackie is one of them. Angela Meyer and Eric Folger are both here, and they are two of them. And Stephen Pizzell is here, and I'm pretty sure Stephen fits that category too. And those are just the people that I know. So I imagine there's a lot more of you. There's Nina, and she does too. Okay. But I often think that whatever success I have had about communicating the wonders of design thinking really is attributable to the fact that all of my education is very squarely in management. I like to say that in the great Harvard Business School tradition, I am the most narrowly educated person that you will ever find. Right? They didn't even let us read theory. All we did was 1,000 cases over a number of years. And so it took me a very long time to find design thinking. And so I think that the journey that I've been on in finding it as a kind of a very traditionally grounded and educated business person and learning about it and its wonderful benefits and methodologies and all that it brings, I thought I'd spend a little time just talking about that story because I think that is in part what has allowed me to be part of such a great conversation with managers. Right? Because the beauty of design thinking is that much of it is sadly counterintuitive to what we've been taught in management. It's sadly in opposition to much of what we're still teaching our MBAs, right? And it's kind of a dysfunction, sadly, I think, of large bureaucratic organizations. We build large organizations for predictability and control. And we need that, right? Certainly in the US, where we've got publicly traded corporations who live and die by their quarterly earnings per share, senior managers have no choice but to put in place a system of processes and systems and culture that allows them to control the operations. But sadly, all of that control that allows us to do such a good job of managing our existing business absolutely gets in our way when we try and invent a new one. And so I think that's the beauty of design thinking. I think it offers an opportunity for organizations who will never really be able to give up all of our ways of operating. It offers us an alternative path that I believe can coexist side by side with the process and system that we've built and really make it possible for us to do the two things that business organizations need to survive. Maintain a healthy, profitable existing business that produces reliable, consistent quality of products and services, but at the same time, invent a new future for themselves and for the people that they choose to serve. So let me talk a little bit about why I think design thinking is so ideally suited to do that. So I'm a strategist by training. After my MBA program, I went to work for the Boston Consulting Group. And so I've always been someone who lived in strategy. I've taught strategy consulting to my students at the Darden School. And of course, when you teach strategy consulting, you spend your life searching for a way to make what you do interesting. Right? Especially if you do strategic planning. So I've often also tended to have an interest in strategic planning, and I always joke that there are actually 5 of us in the world who actually find strategic planning interesting. But in my search for a way to make strategic planning interesting and to convey what I think is the enormous significance of the work we do in strategy, I hit upon this notion of thinking about architecture, right? Because for me, design is really, I'll go back to that in a minute, is really a metaphor for the whole process of strategy making, right? When you think about it, the central notion of design, what designers do, and makes them so wonderfully important to us, is they take a current reality and they transform it into some new and more desirable future. Well, isn't that why we do strategy in business? Right? If we're not in business to do strategy to create new futures, then why do we bother? Because if we want to just keep chugging along doing what we're doing, then we can do it. Right? So my first interest in design really was in following the work of architects and reading their descriptions of how they created new works of architecture. Because it seemed to me that in the same way that architects create a physical space that encourages some behaviors and discourages others, in management, in strategy, we're creating a different kind of space. A space that, when it works, encourages people to behave in the ways we need them to behave in order to meet our strategic goals, and also discourages the ways we prefer that they didn't behave. So this notion of strategy as a design process was really the first way that I began thinking of it. And this notion that in order to do strategy well, we have to tell the truth about current reality, right? So all good strategic change is rooted in being willing to face the brutal truth about our current business and our current level of competition and our current ability to create value for customers. But then at the same time, to have the courage to put out an ideal of a different future, right? And that by opening up that gap in people's minds through envisioning this new future, we create all of the energy for strategic change. And then by applying our traditional business rules around developing new capabilities and aligning systems and process, we get to actually make that future a reality. And then we get to start all over again, right? So for many years, I dealt with this notion of strategy as a metaphor. And I had a series of lengthy debates with Henry Mintzberg, right? Who those of you who are academics know and otherwise know Henry's work well. And Henry had been very pejorative about this notion of design and strategy making. And he had a very, I think, archaic notion of design, right? And so we would have these debates. And finally, Henry decided, he challenged me and he said, Jeanne, really, strategy is not, design is not a metaphor for management. Design is management. And I really think you need to drop this metaphor stuff. So I started looking around at how to move from just talking about design as a metaphor to talking about it in practice. And I began to do a lot of research at that point on organic growth, right? We were very troubled by what we had to offer managers who were looking to grow their business, right? So they would come to us and we would teach them Porter's 5 forces, and we would teach them SWOT analysis and all the traditional kinds of frameworks. And the trouble with all those frameworks were that they never really pointed anyone towards how to find an additional dollar of revenue, right? They were great for M&A work and figuring out which industries to get in and get out of, but in terms of helping people identify new opportunities to create value for customers and to execute against those, they were really largely useless. So as we started to study organic growth in depth, we identified a set of managers who'd managed to grow their business at the top line significantly faster than their market growth rates over a long period of time. And we focused on them, and they taught us a lot. What they taught us was that there were these 2 separate cycles that people seem to get caught in. One, which we have not so creatively named the virtuous and vicious cycle, right? Let me tell you a little bit about a couple of managers. Let me tell you about John. John is a natural growth leader. He's the kind of person that we call the catalyst and profiled in that book, right? John really starts off life with this notion of a growth mindset, and his outlook is life is a journey of learning. Right? And this work actually comes from the work of an organizational psychologist that some of you may be familiar with, named Carol Dweck. She's a psychologist at the Stanford Business School. In fact, all of her research is on elementary school children. And yet it's some of the most useful research for managers to know of any that I know of. Right? What she argues, at least in the US school system, is that early on in school, we pick up one of 2 mindsets. One is the growth mindset that John has. A little bit later, I'll tell you about the fixed mindset that George picks up. And what we find is that when we studied managers 30 years later as mid-career managers, that mindset had impacted a whole series of decisions they made that either left them well prepared to lead organic growth and innovation in their organizations or left them really disabled in many ways. So let me tell you about John. So John has this view of life as a journey of learning. Because of that, he's very accepting of uncertainty. Right? Because we know that we can't have learning in the absence of uncertainty. If we stick to environments where we already know the answer and we know we'll never make a mistake, okay, we can have a lot of predictable outcomes, but we are unlikely to have innovation and growth, right? Because one of the classic aspects of growth and innovation is that we have to step outside of the predictable world that we're living in and step into one where our historic data loses a lot of its predictive value, right? But John's willing to do that because he has this view. So as a result, he seeks new experiences throughout a lot of his career. So John is one of those guys that, he maybe did an engineering degree as an undergraduate. He joined a company in manufacturing. And a few years later, someone came to him and said, John, you're doing so well. How'd you like to try sales for a while? And John said, wow, I don't know anything about sales. Sounds great. Right? So by the time John is a mid-career manager, he has what we call a very broad repertoire. And it's a repertoire just like a musician's repertoire. John has seen a lot of stuff and he can play a lot of pieces by heart. Well, it turns out that that's an incredibly valuable background to have if you're looking for innovation, because as those who study innovation know, this notion that innovation is really creating new-to-the-world things is really bunk in business. Innovation is mostly about recombining existing elements or stealing ideas from other industries and companies that allow you to create better value for customers. Right? And with that, I usually just stop with the notion of wheels on luggage. Okay? Anyone who thinks that innovation has to be something new to the earth, just ponder a minute wheels on luggage. Right? Members of the audience, or probably some of you are too young to remember when we used to actually drag large suitcases through airports without wheels. And I do think it makes you somewhat question the wisdom of mankind that it took us several millennium to figure out that we should put wheels on them, right? And in fact, wheels had been around forever, so had luggage. The mere combination of those two has created tremendous value, right? And that's in part your repertoire, right? That ability to look across a lot of different environments and pull from them to come up with good ideas is, we found, an overwhelming characteristic of the background of managers who are naturally good at this, right? There's a second element of their background that's very important, and that is how they understand customers. Right? Now, there's no one left on the face of the earth, I am convinced, in business who doesn't know they're supposed to be customer focused. Right? And I mean, part of the problem while we were doing this research was to figure out how to say that in a way that everyone didn't just yawn and go, yes, yes, we know we're supposed to be customer focused. Right? And what really helped us here was we were talking to the gentleman who ran the M&M's custom business. And I don't think they've come to Australia yet. But you know, in the US, you can have your little tiny M&Ms printed with any messages you want, provided they are not pornographic. They have a special person who checks that. But now you really can't go to a wedding without having the bride and groom's name and the date of the wedding on M&Ms, or go to a birthday party or a bridal shower or any of these kinds of things. So we were talking to the manager of this business and trying to just understand what language we could use. And we said to him, when you talk to your people about being customer-centric, what do you say to them? I mean, how do you capture what you really mean by customer-centric? And he said to us, I don't ever ask my people to be customer-centric. I don't like that idea. I ask my people to be Cynthia-centric. We said, okay, well, tell us about what that means. And he said, let me tell you about Cynthia. Cynthia is a young, single mother living on very limited income, and as a very special surprise for her son's 5-year-old birthday, she ordered him custom M&Ms at significant financial sacrifice. And then we delivered them 2 days after the party. He said, what I want my people to do is to realize we had a chance to make Cynthia's life better and we made it worse. And so I want them to think of their customers as Cynthia's, not as nameless, faceless customers. Right? And that really captured for us a lot of what differentiated these people, this deep knowing of customers, which is nice, not just in a humanitarian sense. I mean, it's always nice to know people as people, right? But purely from a strategic viewpoint, the better we know customers, the more likely it is that we can identify unarticulated needs. And unarticulated needs are really the key to the most profitable forms of growth, right? Because we all know that as soon as a customer asks us for something, they're asking all of our competitors, and we're entering a new product arena already in head-to-head competition with a group of other people. And this deep knowing of customers, this focus on customers not as people I'm trying to sell stuff to, but as people who have problems in their lives that I'm trying to use my capability as a business organization to solve, turns out to be the most profitable knowing of customers that you can have if your goal is innovation. So we learned a lot from that. And as you looked at John, when you put these two together, his broad repertoire and his knowing of customers, well, it was easy to see growth. And that was one of the most startling things to us in this first set of research we did on organic growth, was that the growth opportunity was always already there. It had been there all along, but no one else had seen it. And so the managers we profiled stepped into a new situation in which nothing had changed except their entry. And they were able to see ways to grow the business that other equally bright and intelligent and skilled managers simply had not seen. Right? And for us, we believe that it's a combination of this deep knowing of customers, and repertoire together. But they did something even more significant. They managed risk through action. They looked a lot like entrepreneurs. We know that, as confusing as it is, and as much as managers refuse to believe this, giving people too much money when they're starting up a new business or innovating is really a bad idea. Because too much money allows them to spend way too much time and resource investing in a new idea without earning $1 of customer revenue from it, right? And what entrepreneurs teach us is when you've mortgaged your house, what you focus on first is how fast can I get a customer to give me money for this, which turns out to be the single most important way to de-risk a new growth opportunity. Because as we know, the major reason that new growth ideas fail is not because companies can't execute them, it's because customers don't want them. So the sooner a customer tells us they don't want something, the better, and they're actually doing us a favor. We just spent a couple of weeks in Silicon Valley because that's where you have to hang out now in the US. And they are an insufferable group for the most part, I will tell you. But one of the interesting things about them is their mantra, it's the fail fast and cheap. Well, first of all, to put the word fail in a mantra for a business, that's surprising enough, right? But what they know, what they've learned, what those venture capitalists like, Kleiner Perkins have figured out, is that no matter how smart you are, when they invest in 10 businesses, if they are very, very lucky and very, very good, 2 will actually turn into profitable business. 8 out of 10 will fail, and it has nothing to do with how smart they are or how often they run the numbers. It has to do with the fundamental uncertainty of innovation and entering a new business space, right? Well, if you know you're going to fail 8 out of 10 times, then what you better develop a competency for is being really, really good at failing, and failing fast and cheap, right? Because, of course, if they knew which 2 of the 10 were the right ones, they wouldn't invest in the other 8. Right? So we find them managing risk through action. That is, instead of sitting in a conference room and arguing with the finance people about why I should be allowed to actually do this, these managers leave the building and go find a customer and start to conduct small experiments, right? And not surprisingly, when they place all these small bets quickly, they succeed more often in new situations, or at least they look more successful because they don't show anybody the failures. They're as good at killing businesses as they are at starting businesses. And the reality of it is, in most large organizations, the only thing harder to do than to start a new business is to kill one you've already started, right? Because someone's career is on the line, right? And that we label that a failure, and we're not allowed to fail 8 out of 10 times in business. Most business organizations, if we don't succeed 10 out of 10, there's something wrong with us as a manager, right? So what we find is John naturally does all this stuff, and he's successful, and that just confirms the fact that life is a journey of learning. But the really interesting thing for most of us, and where I spend most of my time, is on the other side of this with George. Okay, George has picked up the opposite mindset that Carol Dweck talks about in her research with elementary school children. George has picked up the mindset that life is a test and he should never be caught looking stupid. All right? Sadly, and one of Carol Dweck's big complaints about our elementary school system in the US is that we encourage people to think like George. We teach kids, if you don't know the answer, keep your hand down, and if you raise your hand and give the wrong answer, you should be embarrassed. And what that does is leave them with a belief that being smart is the same as being right. And so they spend their lives trying to prove they're smart by never being wrong. And that may equip them to be extremely successful managers of predictable businesses, right? But it turns out to leave them severely disabled if we're trying to help them innovate and grow. So let's look at George is afraid of uncertainty, and it's not an irrational fear. It's not that George is crazy or weak or anything like that. It's an extremely rational fear. He's trying to avoid mistakes, and therefore he must avoid uncertainty, right? Or else he'll make mistakes. But because of that, he avoids new experiences. So after 3 years in manufacturing, when his boss comes to George and says, George, we think you're a high flyer. How about going to sales? George says, are you crazy? I don't know anything about sales. Why would I do that? Right? So by the time we find George as a middle manager, chances are he's just been promoted to P&L responsibility, but he has a very narrow repertoire, and suddenly he's asked to go out and grow his business. Right? This is compounded by the fact that George tends to know customers as data. right? If you ask George if he knows his customers, he's got a 6-inch stack of market research reports on his desk. He knows every statistic. He knows all about Cynthia. Cynthia is 25.6 years old. She has a median income of 30.5, 1.8 children, and he can tell you what her zip code is in the US, right? But sadly, none of that helps him to identify Cynthia's unarticulated needs. So when he's casting around for a new business idea, it is hard for him to see growth opportunities. And it's not that George is any less smart than John. In fact, George probably did better in school and is, along a lot of records, better than John, right? But the reality of it is he just doesn't have the raw material to find growth. And then it gets worse, because George actually listens to this notion that we should manage risk through analysis. So George spends his time doing Excel spreadsheets in his office. He's convinced that if he runs the numbers often enough, not only will he be able to convince finance to let him try it, but that he will actually reduce the risk. The tragedy is, because this historical data he's extrapolating is actually not a very good proxy for this uncertain future, all of that analysis that George is doing nothing whatsoever to reduce the risk of his investment. In fact, John is reducing his investment by placing a portfolio of small bets. So let's say he's placed 10 bets, we know 2 of which will work, and John will figure out which 2. Meanwhile, George, probably by the time he's allowed to act, he's placing a bigger bet, he's probably placing 1 or 2, he's placing it more slowly, and when the negative feedback from the market starts to come back, George tells his people, make it work. There's a lot riding on this. And again, paradoxically, it turns out trying to make a business idea work that doesn't have a valuable proposition to customers in the first place is a really bad idea. Because sure, you can get people to buy it as long as you keep lowering the price and doing more advertising and incenting the sales force, but in the end, it will not be a route to profitable growth, right? Because you're forcing people to take a product that they don't really want in the first place and that they're never going to pay a premium for. So poor George fails more often, and when he fails, it tends to be very visible, which confirms for him, life is a test, and I've just got caught looking stupid, so what do I do now? Right? To me, the beauty of design thinking is not about John, because John doesn't need our help. John isn't showing up at the Darden Graduate School of Business for a week-long class in design thinking, because John is successfully growing his business. He knows how to do this, right? It's George that we have to help. And it turns out that the beauty, to me, of design thinking is that design thinking offers a toolkit and a systematic process that we can teach George, right? Now, will it be foolproof? No. In this world of uncertainty, nothing's foolproof. But can we give him the confidence and the ability to increase his likelihood of success? Absolutely. And let me talk a little bit about why I think that. I think that because what design thinking offers is a problem-solving approach, right? It's just a systematic way of approaching problems. And we have our traditional analytical ways in business that we spend a lot of time on. If we had been teaching our MBAs design thinking all along, I'd be up here talking about the power of an analytical approach to problem solving. Right? The reason why we need design thinking is we've gone so overboard on the analytics, right? Which are appropriate and very important in certain types of environments, but as soon as we tee up innovation and growth as our objective, those tools that work so well in a predictable environment often only give us a false sense of security in an uncertain environment. Whereas design, because design has always, whether you were inventing new software packages or new products or whatever, design has always been about dealing with unpredictable worlds and ambiguous situations, right? And so design comes with a process that really helps us to do that. And what differentiates design to me most significantly are really 2 things. One is the front-end process. We call it what is. And we know one of the things that managers love is to jump immediately to ideation, right? So when you say to a manager, go innovate, their first thought is, let me get in a conference room and start brainstorming, right? Let me come up with my ideas and go forward. What design says is slow down. You're not allowed to generate ideas until you've already developed a very deep understanding of the current situation. Because it turns out if you want to be data-driven, the only good data you've got to think about the future is data about the present, but it's not data that I'm mindlessly extrapolating from pro formas. It's data about current unmet needs of actual human beings. And so design's research methodologies around ethnography, tools like customer journey mapping, are absolutely a way to give a manager like George, who has no clue where to even begin, a structured process for beginning to have a series of conversations with his customers that will allow him to gain some deeper insight. So to me, this what is process is really critical. Right? Then we go into the what if process, which is ideation. And in fact, even there, design has a lot of advantages. Any of us who've been subjected to those god-awful brainstorming sessions where we're asked to come up with 10 creative uses for a paperclip, right? And I always stall after the second creative use. Once I've propped up a torn hem, I'm out of the game on that one, right? And I think most of us managers are. This notion that we just sit and we think creative thoughts, you know, it may work for some people, but it certainly doesn't work for most of us, right? Design actually feeds all of this information we've gathered in the what is process into a form of design criteria that says, if anything were possible, what kind of experience would we be creating for customers? And it turns out when you brainstorm with actual criteria, you come up with a lot more usable stuff, right? So we find in our experience managers who loathe brainstorming, and when you first tell them they're going to have to do it, their eyes roll and they feel so excited at the end of the session because they're so proud of themselves for the great ideas they've come up with, only because we've helped them by giving them useful information to trigger creativity and innovative ideas on their part. So that's important. What wows and what works are really testing stages, and that to me is the second huge contribution of design. It is the experimental methodology, right? We're teaching this to a lot of engineers now, and I always joke that engineers are our sweet spot because they'll never figure out to do this stuff on their own, but once you show them a process and a system and prove to them that it leads to an outcome they want, they'll go back and kill that process on Monday. They'll make it work, right? Whereas the rest of us kind of, especially marketing people, with apologies to all marketing people in the room, they nod their heads and then they go back and do whatever the hell they were doing before they came to see you, right? But what we're finding is these experimental methodologies, which are logically comfortable for a lot of managers, right, actually work. So what we do is we take our ideas that come out of brainstorming, we call them hypotheses, and we subject them to testing. And in part, the most powerful part of this experimental methodology is we say to our finance people, you cannot just veto a manager's ability to try something. What you can do, however, is point out all of the flaws you see in that business idea and make them bring you the data to prove that you're wrong, right? So we often find that the people who are the natural catalysts, the natural growth leaders, because they're optimists, they are great hypothesis generators. But because they're optimists, they're terrible hypothesis testers, right? They just think stuff will work, right? And if you create a methodology where the people who are good hypothesis testers, right, who tend to be those among us who really pay attention to the detail and cross our T's and dot our I's and look at those numbers, if you bring them into the process with a role that's more powerful than just being able to say no, the combined group can do really powerful and useful things, right? And so the process ends with this notion of the learning launch, right, as we call it, which is just a series of small-scale bets. So when we lay the tools that designers have already developed on top of this process, we see that we have a whole toolkit that historically companies like IDEO and Continuum have used for decades that we have never taught to managers. Some of them are harder to teach than others. Tools like a visualization. I mean, Angela will testify. We still struggle to teach visualization to the MBAs. We still want to do a PowerPoint with bullets. Right. Visualization is a hard thing for someone who's not grown up in kind of the design world. Something like journey mapping, though, we've had great success teaching to managers. It's a structured process for mapping the customer journey, so it feels kind of like a flow chart, so it feels natural. The only real difference is now we're going to lay on top of that customers' emotional highs and lows. Because it turns out that in a lot of businesses, we've been competing on functionality for a very long time. And a lot of the runway is by acknowledging that customers are human beings and looking at how we can create emotional payoffs and value for them as well. A lot of people believe that design thinking is primarily something that belongs in consumer products. But my belief is that it's actually even more powerful in the B2B world, because well-known consumer products companies like Coke and Procter & Gamble and all have been using these methods for a long time. It's hard to find competitive advantage in just putting them in. But for businesses in the B2B space, right, I think there's tremendous upside in using these techniques to identify new product opportunities. So it's very exciting. So we've got a set of tools to teach. We've got a process to teach, right? And we're finding it's producing real success. So if I look at the strategic contribution of design thinking, kind of to summarize, we're finding a few key issues. One is that design helps us to stay in the question. And by reframing the question, it helps us to come up with more creative answers, right? Design also helps us to collaborate across difference. We know that fundamental to innovation, since none of us can really get out of our box the way the psychologists always tell us, the best we can do is ask everybody to bring a different set of boxes into the meeting. And by looking across all those different boxes, we can actually find something. So collaborating across difference is important. Speed. We know we live in a world today where it's all about speed, and there's nothing slower than a large organization. Right? And there are some qualities. I think of design as kind of a speed as kind of a Trojan horse, right? Nobody can really be against speed. I mean, even the designated doubters in an organization, when you say we'd like to get a lot faster, how can you be against getting a lot faster? Well, it turns out once someone admits that you should be faster, you've got to re-examine almost all of the rules of business as usual, because anybody who follows the rules in the process ends up painfully slow, and everybody knows that. Right? So huge advantages to speed, and I'll talk a little bit more about how design gets there. The hot word today is curation. Right? It's great for a museum person. Finally, you're going mainstream, Steve. Right? Business people are starting to worry about curation, and design is an outstanding curator. I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to spend a minute on each. And then finally, there's this wonderful notion of emptiness that design builds into what it does. And for strategy, this quality of emptiness is just fundamental. So let me just spend a minute on each of these, and then I'll stop talking. Great quote. We're just finishing up a new book, and the reason why Jackie exerts so much influence on me is because Suncorp and her story are the first chapter of the new book, and if she doesn't give me permission, then I'm in big trouble. So right now I'm doing whatever Jackie tells me to do. But this is a wonderful quote from another person we interviewed for that book, an organization called Design Dublin, which is committed to using design thinking to help cities engage their citizens to help them think about innovation. And what Barry has told us is design thinking forces you to stay in the question and not define exactly what the problem is. We all have a tendency to jump to solutions far too quickly, so design thinking approach forces you to live in this unclear, sometimes very muddy place to get a better understanding. And this ends up producing a much better understanding of the problem and the challenge that you're trying to solve, and in turn allows you to produce a much better set of alternatives to solve it. Right? So this whole notion of re-examining the problem itself is critical. The second notion is collaborating across difference. I think that the issue here is designing innovation raises everybody's game. Because it doesn't just let people work across difference, it leverages the power of difference, right? So we know that one of the challenges we have as managers is that we're expected, diversity is what we're supposed to do today. The reality of global corporations is we're working across very diverse cultures, right? We're working across functions, right? Almost anything we go to do in innovation requires that we cross a boundary. Right? And there's nothing harder than human beings working with each other across boundaries. Right? All that diversity that has so much potential also just is really hard to manage. Our experience has been that the methodologies of design allow people to have a conversation around a common database, which is usually the current reality of their deep customer needs, that actually allows them to work much more powerfully together. I always joke it's like, I know Australians are golfers just like we are in the U.S. Well, there's in the U.S. we play a game, a version of golf called a scramble or best ball. Is that kind of is that a language? Golfers have failed to standardize their language. I will complain about that, right? But the difference between regular golf and best ball is that, in regular golf, the foursome goes off and you actually look like you're playing together, but you're really not. You're playing your own ball. Everybody's got their own clubs, their own ball, right? In best ball, basically everyone hits the tee shot and then you pick the best of the 4 shots and you hit from there, right? What's remarkable about best ball, to me, as a strategist, is that a mediocre set of golfers playing best ball can beat an outstanding golfer playing alone. And why is that? It's because we don't need to be fantastic at every aspect of the game. If we put the team together right, we find a good putter and a good driver and somebody with a good iron game, we don't need to be that Renaissance person who can do it all. Right? And that starts to get really exciting for business because guess what? Most of the time we can't get the best person in the world to come to work for us. Right? If the best we can usually do is get a bunch of normal people to work for us, if we can substantially up their game, that's a pretty attractive proposition, right? And to me, what design thinking allows you to do is to play best ball, right? To literally leverage that difference and leverage each other's strengths to come up not with watered down compromises, but with actually higher order solutions that any one of you could have come in the room with. Right? So that's a really exciting opportunity. Let me talk about speed. I think engagement and alignment and this curation that I'm going to talk about a little bit is where speed comes from, right? So why are we slow in organizations? One, we're slow because every fiefdom has a different set of objectives and doesn't want to play nicely together, right? We're slow because people are like mostly reading their email and only half invested at any point in time in work. Right? And we're slow because we have a mountain of data coming at us at any point in time and we're trying to figure out how many emails do we stop reading before we finally stop and actually try and accomplish something. Right? Design really works for all of those. It works for engagement because in this latest study we've done, so the follow-up, the book that we're working on right now is a detailed study of 10 companies who've used design thinking to allow them to accomplish outcomes other than organic growth. So I've always really, out of my strategy perspective, focused on the value of design thinking as a way to get to growth. But we know that it's terrific as a basic problem-solving methodology, so it can do a lot more than that. And so we were just getting a lot of requests from managers to understand, well, how do I use design thinking for other things other than growing my business? So we've profiled these 10 companies. One is Suncorp, and the fantastic story that Jackie led about them using design thinking as a post-merger integration tool. We have a chapter on IBM using design thinking to rethink their trade show policy. One on 3M using design thinking as a way to engage and revise their sales process. Right? One on Toyota using design thinking to redesign their call center for Lexus. So we've got all these stories like that, right? What we're finding in these stories is the kind of unexpected benefit is employees are becoming totally engaged by involvement in the design process, right? So the call center employees at Toyota, the design process not only studies them and maps their journey and tries to understand in detail exactly what the frustrations are in their lives, but it invites them into the process, right? So by the time you're ready to actually implement something, the buy-in is already there because employees are involved in the process and committed to it to begin with. So I think this engagement is tremendous. The alignment is tremendous because how often do new business ideas in organizations get slowed down by the fact that we get into the meeting and it's a debate? I've got my set of facts, you've got your set of facts, and we're just debating back and forth. And who wins? Either the person with the most power or we all kind of give up and come up with some crummy combined solution that really doesn't create value for anybody, but at least it gets us out of the conference room, right? With a data-driven, customer-driven approach like design provides in that discovery front end, you can actually get people aligned about what the problems are and what the design criteria are for the best possible solution. And it turns out that once you get people to agree on the criteria for a good solution, actually agreeing on the solution itself is really pretty easy, right? And then finally, the third element that really helps with design is speed, is curation. And let me just talk a minute about this. This is a quote from Wired magazine. We're surrounded by too much music, too much software, too many websites, too many feeds, too many people, and too many opinions. right? And they're all coming at us, and we're trying to figure out which ones to pay attention to. Okay? We absolutely know that too much information degrades the quality of decision making. It does not improve it. You know, there's this famous jelly study that's just come out that I'm sure everyone's read about, you know, which is they tested how many jellies do we put in front of you to maximize your purchasing of jellies. Turns out if we put more than 13 jellies in front of you, we all just kind of spaz out and can't handle it and don't buy any. Right? And I think the same thing is happening with information, right? That we've got so much of it. We know we've actually got to stop taking in information and do something at some point, but we don't know what information to work with. What designers are fantastic at is mining large amounts of deep data for insights. So they've got these clustering tools like mind mapping and things like that that allow you to take a mass of data. They allow you to take 15 two-hour interviews and distill it down ultimately to a 2-minute video that can convey to people the real deep unmet needs of our customers. One of my favorite stories is in the new book is about this project called Fiji. It sounds like a group of people very similar to Hargraves in that it is a group of all of the leading finance and insurance companies in France where the chief innovation officers have gotten together and begun to meet and try and collaborate to see if they can help each other. Well, they reached out to Parsons Paris to do a design thinking project. I am on tape here, right? I was just going to say being bankers and being French. You can imagine what they were up against. And yet, it turns out that they managed to distill all of this work that the designers and the ethnographers had done into a video that was literally 2 minutes long. And at the start of the project, all of the organizations had agreed to carefully measure the positive outcomes of the project to help the academics demonstrate the design thinking was a good thing. After they saw the video and they worked with it, they refused to waste the time measuring it because they said, we get it. We understand it. We know more about our customers now than we did before. We just did a journey mapping project with our own MBA students, and our faculty member who heads the quantitative analysis area, I'll just pause on that for a minute, right? Left the meeting and said, I learned more from those students in 1 hour than I learned in the last 20 years about the real lives of the students. Right? That's the power of these methods. Right? They're powerful at distilling down to a small set of key insights that free managers to feel like they have the story and can begin generating ideas. And that's the power of curation. And I think it is a little recognized quality of design that is going to get a lot more attention as we go forward, because I see no signs that the avalanche of information coming at us is going to start to decrease anytime soon. Finally, let me talk a little about emptiness. Emptiness is my favorite, right? And this is a Picasso quote that I love. To finish a work, to finish a picture, what nonsense. To finish it means to be through with it, to kill it, to rid it of its soul. How often do we finish off our strategies to such a level of detail that they're dead before they even get to the people who are meant to implement them, right? One of the things that has fascinated me is why people watch reality television. Okay, I consider this one of the great mysteries of our age. Right? I am obviously not a reality television person, but I know many extremely well-educated, very smart people who organize their life about getting home to see who was getting thrown off the island this week. Okay? And I just read an academic report not long ago on reality TV that really made sense to me. And it said the reason why people watch reality TV is the same reason why they watch sports. It's the not knowing that makes it interesting. Right? It has always fascinated me that my son is a huge European soccer fan. Right? So he TiVos all the games. But if he finds out the final score, he will not watch the game. So he walks around with his fingers in his ears, you know, after Manchester United plays someone so that it doesn't leak in because it ruins it. And I've always thought that was rather bizarre. But again, it's the not knowing, right? So that same uncertainty that makes us nervous and makes us avoid new experiences, if we figure out how to tame it, it's also the thing that makes us curious and energizes us to be part of something, right? So we all want to be part of a work in process. Every year I take my students to Sagrada Familia as part of a class. Those of you who've had a chance to see that, you know, Gaudi's beautiful unfinished cathedral in Barcelona. And I really dread the day they finish it. Because the experience these students have going into an unfinished cathedral, and they finally took the Coke machines out of it last year, which was really disappointing because I loved being in a cathedral they were working on that had Coke machines all lined up and all. You really got the sense that you were in the middle of something really amazing being constructed. And you were part of the construction. You know, your $15 actually went to the construction. Right? And all that will be lost when it's done. It will just be another amazingly beautiful cathedral that we'll walk in and we'll feel a sense of awe, but we won't feel a sense of ownership because we won't have been part of it. And I think that's what design brings to us in the strategy area, right? Strategy is almost the last bastion of executive privilege. It's the only thing senior managers are still allowed to do on a retreat with McKinsey. Right? Right? Because we're all still really afraid that if we only let everybody else into the process, they will royally muck it up. Right? And again, design thinking teaches us that this is all an iterative process. It turns out if you engage people and you involve them and you treat every idea you have as a hypothesis and you get good at testing it, then you can make strategy even a much more participative process than it is. So let me just summarize. I've talked a long time. It's very hard to measure design's impact. One of the things that I would say originally we were disappointed in this book, every single person we interviewed, we said, okay, so tell us the data to prove that design works, right? And sure, we have some hard measurable outcome. We can talk about how IBM's redesigned trade show produces 10 times the hot leads that the old one did, right? We can talk about how Suncorp's post-merger integration process increased the percentage of people who felt that they really understood and were personally committed to the new strategy by, 100%. We can get those data, but they're really beside the point, right? Because the real changes are happening much deeper. The real changes are happening in the kinds of conversations people have in organizations. And it's interesting. With all of our technology today, and all of the things that we can do with technology, in the end, leadership still happens in conversation. It happens in face-to-face conversation. And changing people's behavior and motivating them and inspiring them to do new things happens when leaders have great conversations with their people. And one of the things that design thinking does is it radically changes the conversation. And then finally, and perhaps most significant in all, it changes how people think. It changed how those French bankers understood and saw their customers. And in the end, we may never be able to tie that to a hard defined increase in revenues or decrease in costs or increase in return on investment. But in my experience, most of the people who work with design thinking and actually experience it and see the power of what it produces, stop asking the ROI question and start asking the question of how do we learn more about this and how do we get better at it. So I have talked for a very long time. Thank you very much for your patience at this hour at the end of a long weekend. Thank you.